So I was reading this and I was just thinking, my God, there's so much in it, Ashwin. I mean, there's China and there's the Arabs and there's the Indians, of course, and there's spiritualism, science, quantum physics, mathematics. I'm a bit overwhelmed, actually.
I know. See, this is the problem in my life, Manjula. That with every book I end up disappointing some people. When I had initially written the Rosabal line, so there were some people who absolutely went crazy over that book. And they said, wow, the sort of connections that he has made, those are incredible. And then I ended up writing Chanakya's chant. And with Chanakya's chant, the people who loved the Rosabal line hated me. Because they said, ye kya hai? He has cheapened himself.
Cheapened himself?
हाँ, because ये तो लग रहा है जैसे कोई Bollywood story है, you know. Fine. Then the Krishna key came along. But by then, the people who had started loving Chanakya's chant, they got upset with me with the Krishna key. Because that had much more information, mythology, theology, and so many other things. So the reality is that with every book in the Bharat series, I cannot possibly please everyone. And Keepers of the Kaalchakara was really a quest to find the common ground between Hindu and Buddhist philosophy on one hand and quantum physics on the other. So the topic itself was such that I knew that it's going to overwhelm some people. But I said, let me not worry about that, because ultimately you cannot start worrying about what people will think or whether they will like it or not like it, because then that hampers your creativity. So you need to write the way you want to write it. Then you figure out a way to make people like it. So that's fundamentally where I was coming from.
Okay, and when I was reading it, I was thinking, my God, you've plotted so much. So talk about your plotting of this, because there's so many stories within stories.
Yeah, but with Keepers of the Kaalchakara, frankly, the research, this is the most difficult book I've ever written. And probably it's not only difficult from the angle of me as a writer, but it's also difficult for you as a reader. Because there are many concepts which are introduced through the book, which if you are not a science student, you may find overwhelming, So in my case, I wasn't a science student, and it took me about almost around 2.5 to 3 months to understand the basics of quantum theory, and that too through a friend who was an IIT engineer. I said, yaar, mere saath baith ke mujhe quantum theory 101. Treat it as quantum theory 101, that you're basically educating me. So once that entire process happened, then I started the process of reading up and trying to figure out as to how I could draw those connections. Then it became relatively simple, but that entire process ended up taking more than a year. And then, as you know, my plotting always ends up taking at least 3-4 months. So that took another 3-4 months, but the writing did not take more than 6-7 months. So that was rather effortless. The illustrations took a long time.
I was going to ask about the illustrations.
The illustrations took a long time because there are more than 50 illustrations in the book.
Graphs and scientific drawings and maps.
Yeah, because as they say, picture is worth 1,000 words. So
what is this? This is Kumari Kandam.
Yeah, that's right. The portion which was which is sometimes referred to as Lemuria, and which was supposed to be the connecting landmass
between Australia and India.
Exactly.
So all these maps and illustrations, you were going to talk about that?
No, well, I mean, I had the same illustrator who did Krishna Key for me, because Krishna Key also has at least a good 40 or 50 illustrations. But it was the same illustrator, and the way it worked was basically that I would first hand draw it, and in my funny sort of way, because I'm not an artist, so I would say, "Mujhe ye chahiye," and then he would have to sort of imagine as to what I was talking about, because the paper did not the paper would not convey anything in terms of what I actually wanted. So that process went on back and forth, and in fact it was only at the stage of the final edit of the book that all the pictures actually emerged. So it was a laborious process.
So the actual, from the time you got the idea for this book to the actual end of the execution, you said, "Bas ho gaya, last page." How long was it?
So let me tell you, the idea had actually occurred a long time ago, and the idea had started with a dream. It had started with a nightmare. So I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that the book doesn't turn out to be a nightmare. But the original idea was waking up one morning, and sometimes you must have noticed that sometimes the dream or the nightmare is so real that you get up either exhausted or you've broken out in sweat or what have you. It was one of those. And a couple of hours later in the morning, I was chatting with my wife over a cup of tea, and I said, this felt so real. It was almost as if I was living it, as if it was a parallel life. And then I began wondering that same day, and this was of course after a couple of pegs of whiskey in the evening, that I began to think to myself, I said, what if that dream is my real life? And what if me being on stage here at the Delhi Literature Festival with Manjula throwing questions at me and with Meenakshi ji on one side, what if this is the dream? What if the real life is the dream life and the dream life is the real life? And that basic notion sort of stuck to me, and I said, this is something worth exploring. And of course, in physics, there is a concept which is called quantum entanglement, which talks about the idea that two very basic particles, can be entangled. So you could have one particle sitting in New Delhi and the other one in New York, and both of them behave identically, except for the fact that the direction of their spin is opposite to one another. And if you really think about it, this is very much there in Hindu philosophy. It's there through Shiv Shakti, which are basically entangled in some ways, and opposite polarities, dualities in that sense. It is there in
that in the book,
it is there. Exactly. It's there in Zen with the yin and yang and so many others. So that is the idea that I wanted to explore. The nature of duality, polarity, and how our ancient gurus and our sadhus and our mahants were actually leading us in the direction of what quantum theorists today are telling us through experimentation. So today we have experimentation. In those days it was probably more experiential.
So you sat and you thought this all out?
Yeah, over a period of time.
Okay.
And of course, you go through the research process, and when you're researching and when you're reading and when you're talking to people, more and more material comes your way, and you realize that no, this is also connected, and maybe this is a great way of explaining it. One of my basic problems with this book was how to make the concepts much more understandable. So for example, I mean, our rishis talked about the notion that when you are in deep meditation, what you are aiming for actually is a sense of nothingness, where you almost merge yourself into the universe, and then you begin to realize that the barriers that have been created are artificial. Now, that nothingness, I was wondering कि मैं कैसे इसको explain करूँ? How do I explain it? So if you notice towards the end of the book, I don't know whether you've reached anywhere close to that, but the idea was that, okay, there is a iPad and you're using the iPad, and when the screen is on, you can't see your fingerprints. But when you shut off the screen, you realize how dirty it is, because your fingerprints are all there, the smudges are there. And so it's only when you have nothingness that you can actually see the reality. And that was the way then I went around explaining that. So for everything I had to find examples that were relatable. And take for example the idea of observer and observed. That quantum theory is now telling us that you can't actually simply observe, because the observer also has an effect on the observed.
Yes.
Correct? Now, how do you explain that to someone who has not got a background in physics? One of the notions that I put up was that, well, think about Google search. You're searching for something on Google, and you think that Google is throwing up results, but your search is also affecting the results.
Yeah, there's a whole few pages when you
That's right.
examine.
So I had to try and find simpler ways of making the material more understandable.
Okay, but I also found that you've put in a lot of research in many different kinds of things. Things like, of course, secret societies and
Oh, I love that. And there has to be enough blood, so
yes,
there are lots of murders.
And I have to say that the beginning is like really good, because I'm looking at these two characters and thinking, oh, is that Trudeau? Is that Trump? But he's got black hair.
This is what timing. If you notice, the character who resembles Trudeau has been killed off in the first 6 pages. And then, of course, I'm not going to say what happens in the end, but actually that character, I was just thinking to myself, I had never thought that the timing of this visit was going to be along with this book release.
Yeah. I said, oh, maybe this is not this is not a very good idea, because he drops dead. In the book. So drop dead, literally.
Touché, absolutely.
So it's an exciting beginning as well, and then I was quite struck by how this whole thing about the deaths without any, you don't know how they die.
That's right.
And how did that strike you? Because it's the most scary kind of death with these guys, and there's no poison, nothing, but they're suddenly just dead in a horrible way.
That's right.
So,
I think it was. By the way, have you reached the end of the book? Is
No,
yet?
I'm not reached
You're
the end.
halfway.
Don't tell me.
No. So that's why I wanted to be sure.
No spoilers.
No spoilers.
Nobody else is also
So
dead.
the point is that I wanted to. I think it was the great thriller writer Tom Clancy who said that a thriller is asking a question at the beginning and answering it by the end. So I like to throw lots and lots of stuff at you, and you're wondering as to how is this connected. Someone is dying in South America, and someone is dying in Japan,
and this
there's all
Secret
this
Service agent is having this Vipassana thing.
Exactly.
Why?
So and then the other part of it is also, frankly, a lot of thrillers are about the impossible, right? That's where the thrill comes from. That it's so unbelievable. For me, at least, the notion was that is it possible that you could actually have a scenario where what the rishis of old times were telling us was actually what has already been discovered now, and is there a way to use that, whether for positive or negative? And that's where the mystery in this book comes from.
But that's a very Indian idea, no? That the rishis have told us, like our ancestors.
Oh yeah, of course, of course.
But you've made it very contemporary in the book.
Yeah, but the worry I always have, to a very great extent, Manjula, is that sometimes we end up throwing the baby with the bathwater. So today, for example, when someone tells me, hey, listen, there was a Pushpak Viman and Ramchandraji got into that, and he, for me, that's not really palatable. I'm not able to understand it. Or if someone was to tell me that the Vatican got its name from Vatica, then I again have a problem with that. But on the other hand, there are many, many ideas in the deeper world of spirituality and philosophy which have tremendous relevance. And particularly Vedanta, I think that, and the Upanishads, there is tons and tons of material out there. And why go far? Even the greatest proponents of of quantum theory, like Bohr and Heisenberg, said that, you know, for someone who has read Vedanta, quantum theory will not sound so strange, because a lot of those ideas have actually been explored in substantial detail. So I think we need to sort of attain the perfect balance in terms of ensuring that we keep what is relevant, but not becoming crazy about it.
So what I was saying, that you've taken these ideas and you've made them, you know, you use them in a very contemporary way. So was that difficult?
Well, I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, the notion that for me, it's never been about myth per se, and you've heard me say that 100 times. It's not about myth, it's not about history, it's about connections. And if you take these two words, myth and history, and bring them together, you get a mystery. But this time I've gone
There's a section about that as well, no?
That's
myth
right.
and history.
That's right. So the section that Manjula is referring to is the fact that there is a conversation which happens where someone asks that, you know, what is mythology? And the guru says that mythology is a set of lies that people rarely believe. And then she goes on to ask, what is history? And he replies that history is a set of lies that people have agreed to believe. So, but at the end of the day, both of them contain some element of truth. Yeah, they contain truth, but they are layered. I mean, we have 300 versions of the Ramayana. Which of those are we going to consider the absolute truth? Or for example, you had an epic like the Jaya, which was 25,000 verses, which became the Bharat of 50,000 verses, which eventually morphed into the Mahabharata of 100,000 verses. Again, how much of layering happened in each of these? So I think ultimately what one is looking for is a deeper truth in that, not the literal truth.
Okay, going back to this thing about how you said that you're exploring, you know, both Hinduism and the Buddhist ways of thinking. Talk a bit about that.
Sure. I mean, in Buddhism, you know, there is a story about the Buddha during the last year of his life. And during the last year of his life, he was visited by a king from a kingdom up north, which was called Shambhala. And the king's name was Suchandra. And Suchandra sat before the Buddha and said that, listen, you will attain moksha. You've already attained moksha because you are a sadhu. You've given up the world. But what about me? I mean, I'm a king. I'm surrounded by all the worldly issues. I have a state to govern. I will never be free of all of this worldly stuff. So how do I also attain that state? And apparently what the Buddha came up with was the concept of Kaalchakara. And the notion of the Kaalchakara, of course, if we split it down, is two words, Kaal and Chakra. Kaal means time, and Chakra means wheel. Yeah. So it's the wheel of time.
The wheel of time.
So the thought that was there was that, okay, where does what is in the center of this Kaalchakra? Because if you notice, the mandalas which are made by Buddhist monks are basically a series of circles.
Yeah.
What they are indicating is you and your interaction with the wider universe. The ground you walk on, the air that you breathe, the planets that surround you, the millions of stars in the galaxies and the millions of galaxies. All of that is factored into Kaalchakra. But in the center of the Kaalchakra, you don't see only Buddha. You see Buddha along with a female consort. And she is known by different names, most commonly Vishwamata. But actually that has been structured on Shiv Tantra, of Shiv Shakti. So then I started sort of digging deeper that where did this influence come from, and it actually comes back from the time of Padma Sambhav or the Lotus Born. And he picked up many concepts from Shiv Tantra and brought them into what is now commonly called Tibetan Buddhism.
Yes.
So that is again another area of exploration which this book takes you into.
So Tantra was another thing that you went and you kind of...
Yeah, because a lot of people misunderstand Tantra.
Yes.
That what is, they associate it with all the negative stuff, tantric.
Yeah.
They associate it with that. But actually what...
but that's more an Indian view, na? I mean, I don't think the Buddhist religions...
That's right. That's right. So, but what it actually means is that you can also utilize negative energies for very positive things. Tantra, if you really think about it, in Sanskrit, it means to weave. So it's again about discovering your intimate connections with the entire universe. And the best example of that is the peacock. The Buddhists love giving that example, that the peacock is able to consume poison and doesn't die from that poison, and instead its plumage becomes brighter. So you can take something which is very negative and convert it into positive. And that is where Tantra comes into the picture.